Hello everyone, my name is Kirill. The title of this video is quite interesting and provocative. Now I'll explain what it's based on. Today we're going to take a look at two interesting frameworks, Solid and Qwik. But we won't be looking at them as a lesson like we usually do, where we dive into a technology over a certain period of time. We look at it as a killer feature that exists in a particular framework but isn't present in React. We'll also see how this could be implemented in React and where exactly. And we'll also take a look at how other frameworks have already implemented this and how it works there. Both in Solid and in Qwik, there's one interesting thing that remains. Right now, there's a unification happening, and the approach is similar to React. So overall, whether it's Solid or Qwik, if you look at them with the naked eye, they're very similar to ours. What does this mean? It's very convenient for us to switch from what we've already learned to something new without having to memorize or dive in deeply. Even on our first look now, we can understand what's going on here and how everything interacts. Now, let's take a look at a killer feature that Solid has signals. In fact, after signals appeared, they caused quite a stir. Even Angular itself introduced signals, and this became quite an interesting development, because previously, when we talked about reactive programming and the concept of reactivity in JS in general, we looked at a library like RxJS. We had observables, we had objects, and we would subscribe to them. A signal is very similar to our use state. It's the same thing. We have our value updater creates signal. Here, we accept the type of signal we have as a generic, and here we'll just have a counter. There's one very interesting difference between signals and use state. We have to call our value, that is, here we call it as a function and get our value directly. And then when we change our value, for example, our count value and second count, next we wrote two buttons that change our value. Here it looks like this, and every time we, roughly speaking, made changes or implemented logic, we had to subscribe to it, we had to pass parameters. That's in the case of React. If we're talking about RxJS and reactivity, we're talking about the fact that we subscribed in different places and we really had a lot of subscriptions. And in general, when working with RxJS, there are a lot of subscriptions. It can get confusing. You can lose track of references. There can be a lot going on, and it can become inconvenient and hard to manage. In the case of Solid, I've actually already launched Solid here. We see that we have a create effect. Create effect is the same as use effect. Basically, it gets called at a certain stage. Here, it only runs once during the initial render, so it's the same as if we passed an empty array as the second parameter. This is our create effect, and then it gets more interesting. We enter the account and enter our account. How is this going to interact? Because it seems like we have two counts, so how will our create effect behave when our second count changes? I've displayed all of this. Here's our direct output in Solid. So where do we start? We change our first count. We click count update. So let's go to our console, or rather let's check our console. Let's clear all of this. Let's reload and see what's happening. First we get our hello. That is, we've mounted everything. And then initially count is 0 and it mounts. Well, naturally we have lifecycle hooks, but here there are only 3 of them. On mount when mounting, on clean when unmounting, and on error when an error occurs. That's good. Next, let's take a look. We have updates to our two counters. Every time we update our counter, we should see certain console logs. Well, it's not clear what exactly we will actually see. If we update our first counter, we see that our count is displayed. Our count is displayed again, and also our little object, which is formed from our two signals. I'll explain this a bit later. That's good. But if we clear all of this and only trigger our second count, in other words, here we call our object. Or actually, let's remove the create effect here so it doesn't get confusing. Let's say we don't have any of that. Let's reload, remove it, call our first count. We see that the count is displayed. We call the second count, and our count simply changes. So the subscription happens right inside our create effect. We don't get lost among multiple subscriptions. And if we need to interact with a specific signal, we create a create effect and work with it. Now, I'd like to promote my Telegram channel in the description. There you can find all video announcements and additional information. There we also hold various polls about which video should come out, what we should do, and maybe some additional activities that come up. We sort all of that out there as well. You can submit your project for review, sign up for a mock interview, and things like that. So check out the description, join my Telegram channel, and subscribe. And here we have a different situation. We have a memo crate basically. It's the same kind of memoization as in React. It's a handy thing as well. Here we're creating a computed signal. In other words, we have a signal that operates based on two other signals. So how will our changes be reflected? It would seem that we have two signals and we change one of them. So do we also need to change the second one for our computed signal to be reflected in the console? After all, it also seems to be some kind of signal, or is it not? Or how does all of this work? Let's take a look now. Well, you've already seen actually in the consolidation how this will look. Every time we update our count is displayed directly, which we are processing here. Because in Create Effect, we subscribe to our signal, and right after we change the value, we see, aha, the count value has changed. So the create effect that works with the computed signal, which forms an object from our count, and the second count will also be displayed. That is, we understand that signals are quite a flexible thing, which gives us the ability to interact with our reactivity very, very easily. Every time, well, rather when signals appeared, everyone was predicting that everything else was dead and so on. In reality, right now, Rx and signals work more as a bundle rather than signals on their own, for the simple reason that some of the functionality provided by Rx is simply not implemented by signals. So here, the signal mainly serves to allow us to instantly get our current values on the fly without subscriptions. This is very convenient. As we can see, we don't subscribe to anything, we get the value immediately. In other words, the current implementation of signals is already available to use even in the same Qwik. It's there too, because it's such an interesting thing. It's already present in Angular, in our established framework. It's already there. So you can already interact with it. Here, I've also highlighted other components and features that we have in Solid when we work with things like if statements. That is, we display something. Previously, in our React code, we would just write a symbol twice, but here it works differently. We have separate components that handle this. We specify exactly which parameter we'll use to display everything and what we'll show in case of an error. And then what we pass in here is the same for for as well. We have components, and we also have things like bounty. Next, there's a difference in how we handle asynchrony. There's also a slightly different approach to asynchrony there. When we work with asynchrony, we need to write here, I've highlighted it for us, we get our data. We put this function into a resource. This resource, roughly speaking, has the same signal as the one provided by the signal crate. We can also subscribe to it. As the second parameter, we pass an object here that has two fields. Refresh. That is, we can get a refetch. In other words, we can make the request again and emit it. Basically, all of this is done so that we also get our signal from the resource and can interact with the signal. Our todos look as follows. Here we get the todos, we have loading, and we also have error. In case we want to display errors, we also check there when the todos error exists, we display our error directly. And that's basically how it works in Solid. If we talk about signals and how this is implemented in other frameworks, as I already mentioned, it's implemented very well. In Angular, it works in conjunction with RxJS. Again, you can choose not to use RxJS and only use these signals, or vice versa with RxJS and not use signals. But currently, the general trend in development is to use RxJS and signals together. Now let's move on to the Scream. Again, I want to clarify that I won't be discussing the aspects of Qwik, meaning how it implements certain logic similar to Reactor or other approaches. We'll focus on the feature that we have. This is the loading of our applets on demand. Roughly speaking, when we navigate to our page, what do we want to see in front of us? But Qwik decided to do things differently. When everything is rendered, we see something in front of us. In other words, only what we actually see in front of us is rendered. Why is that? So as not to overload the rendering process itself, and it's important to understand that only what we specifically see is rendered. Things we don't interact with are neither rendered nor loaded. So if we click on a button or interact with a counter, the files responsible for updating that counter are loaded at that moment. Let's take a look at this right now. We can see that our client and MGS files are quite small and simple, so you can quickly look through them. Everything here is as straightforward as possible, and all of them are pretty minor things. That's a good thing. Now let's remove this and try updating our counter. We update it and see that our values are loading. Naturally, if we refresh again, everything loads, everything works. So what is being implemented in our Qwik event? And as for the Qwik, it's implemented in the same way. There's nothing special you need to do, no specific steps required. In other words, you don't need to write any hooks, special cases, functions, and so on. It handles all of that out of the box. Every time we interact with some logic with our components, counters that implement logic, like creating an order or anything else, at that moment, we load our handler. In other words, we load only what we need at that specific point in time. We don't load everything all at once. If we load everything, we get our standard interaction. In the case of the Qwik, we load only that specific part, only the handlers we actually need. Now let's take a look at how all of this looks on the inside. Again, we see a situation very similar to what we have with our solid, and overall it looks quite similar to React as well. Here we see that we have the same component, but everything here is very reminiscent of Qwik. Qwik implements this in a way that's very similar to the DOM right from the start. Let's move on. We can see here that we have a signal. Once again, we're using our favorite signals that we have. We have our signal. Here, we implement the logic to update our signal, and we receive the value. So right here, we display the value of our signal, and here we update the value of the signal. Every time we want to change our signal, that is, update our account, we need to use the add symbol, so to speak, as a reactive handler for our changes. Here we receive the new value, we assign our account to this new value, and then we can work with it quite effectively. And in order to implement the logic of providing our developers with what they request, we don't need to do anything except download our Qwik directly. Now, I'm describing the situation with React, and naturally React is not dead. Of course, React is alive and well. It's important to understand that these killer features, in one way or another, I think, will eventually be implemented in React, either in a hybrid form or fully. As for signals, it's more of a hybrid format that will be implemented within our websites. Maybe some of our subscriptions will go away, maybe something along those lines. That's basically it. We've looked at the features available in Solid and Qwik. If you want a video specifically about these technologies, as I mentioned, you know what to do. And in general, to support me as a creator, your subscription or maybe sharing this with a friend or anyone else would mean a lot to me and really help promote the video. So subscribe, leave a like, and write a comment. Thank you all.